Because there is so little justice in a narcissistic relationship and so little justice after these relationships happen, the idea of revenge can create that sense that helps us get to the other side, to know that maybe there would be some consequences, that they suffered the way you did. It makes sense. Human brains are wired for that, right? The problem with revenge is that it keeps you stuck. Closure. It's funny, when I think about closure, one of the first places I go are movies, television, even books we read, right? I think so many times part of the reason we get drawn to certain stories is that there's a comfort when at the end of the film, there's closure. The villain goes to jail. The bad guy gets shot before he could shoot someone else. The person who struggled wins a prize or has the happy ending or whatever it may be, right? And I honestly think the reason those films are so entertaining is there's a tension that goes away for us. We're like, justice is served, right? And it's why sometimes we can even watch the same movie over and over again, because there's a real tension reduction that comes from, and this story ended just the way I wanted it to end. What we don't do well is when a story, film, anything ends in sort of an unjust way. And any of you who have ever sat in a focus group where they're trying to decide which ending they want for a film, a classical example would be, if I remember reading articles about Pretty Woman. And originally in Pretty Woman, they were actually not going to have the man and woman come together, which actually would have been a far more realistic ending. Even more realistic, it would have been that the woman, Julia Roberts' character, ended up sort of strung out on drugs and probably died prematurely. Not the ending people wanted. So they end up together, right? But so sometimes writers are even made to sort of shift endings, even when they're based on books. They will change the ending to make it more movie palatable, right? And I know this personally, that for me, a real healing, like when I'm really having a bad day, I will pick up what I consider a just TV show or a just book or a just movie so I can see the justice happen at the end, because it will actually calm me down. So I'm giving this all meant to say, we love us some closure. Guess where closure almost never happens? Narcissistic relationships. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the key ones is that they never really apologize, right? We see this happen in the public sphere all the time. Celebrities give apologies that were written by moderately literate publicists. And in general, they often don't reflect on the pain of the person they harmed. It's like, I'm sorry, and I know I did something wrong, and I need help. But never like, and I harmed someone, right? Because there's probably, in addition to that silly publicist, an attorney saying, well, don't say that, don't say that, right? So these aren't sincere apologies. Whether it's a fancy famous person making some sort of public apology, or whether it's just a regular person in your life, getting a sincere, genuine apology from a narcissistic person is impossible. And the reason is, to be able to apologize sincerely, you actually have to be attuned and plugged in to the pain and the harm you caused to another person, and then be willing to see your role in it, and then commit to not doing it again, and still acknowledging their pain. That's a lot of thens. And a narcissistic person is simply not capable of it, which is why an apology from a narcissistic person feels like empty calories, and you don't feel closure at the end. At the most of it, it almost feels like their mother sent them next door to come apologize to you. It doesn't feel like it's authentic. It feels like a third party told them to apologize. The workplace required them to apologize, but it's not coming from them. So we don't get real apologies. The second thing is, sort of building on that, is you don't get any real accountability. Now, obviously, a good apology is based on real accountability, but there's never responsibility taking. There's never accountability taking. By the time it's done, if you really were to peel back the layers of the onion of your narcissistic conversation, especially if something went wrong and they're responsible for why it went wrong, or they're responsible for the harm, you'll still see that the odds are is that they never fully took accountability or responsibility. And again, it's very difficult to have closure if the person who was responsible or accountable for something going wrong didn't take responsibility for it. Instead, they make excuses, or they're defensive, or they push back. There's no closure. You may still be hurt if something happened. But if someone took accountability or responsibility, at least you don't feel gaslighted. At least you don't feel like you're losing your mind. And that right there, just that sense of like, okay, there's not something wrong with me. They did take responsibility. I'm still incensed, but they owned it. Now you get to feel sane. And that at least is a step closer to closure. So you have that piece of it. A big contributor to the lack of closure, though, frankly, is that narcissistic people seem to move on into new lives like that. Okay, so let's use the intimate partner kind of an example. By and large, when a narcissistic person ends a relationship with you, they've got their new supply teed up. They do. And I'm not saying that non-narcissistic people don't do this too, sure, but narcissistic people almost always do. They're not going out into a world of no supply. So they're going to make sure they've got whatever it is they've got set up, is sort of set up. So they're getting it all set up. And then they will make, I'm just sort of mentally kind of going through 10 to 15 narcissistic breakup stories I've heard recently. Every single one of them had new supply lined up. And so, well, that's the opposite of closure. When you see that you've been left, many times you feel completely taken out by it. You're kind of surprised by it. You still thought there was something to talk about. And then you come to find out they're already in someone else's arms. And you're like, oh, now it all makes sense. No closure. Now just rage and grief and more rage and anger on your part of, oh my gosh. And then there's no apology, no accountability. And my favorite is when it's clear there was an overlap. The narcissistic person doesn't just own it and say, yep, I did that. You're broken up now. And they won't own it. And they will literally double, triple, and quadruple down on the idea there was never an overlap. There was never an overlap. Folks, there was an overlap. And so you don't conveniently break up with someone on a Monday and find your new person on a Tuesday. That ain't how the world works. So that idea that they could just move into something like that, and you're struggling, and they're not taking responsibility, and they're not even copping to the truth, that is a very difficult circumstance under which to find closure. And while that's in intimate relationships, we see the most sort of clear example of that, even in family relationships, when it's very clear a family member did something harmful or cruel or or deceitful or betraying or any of that, and the family still rallies around them, it's hard to feel closure in those circumstances. I've even heard people say where they've seen sort of marriages where the narcissistic partner far outlived the non-narcissistic partner, and they'll say, this doesn't feel right to me. I have no closure. Like, this doesn't feel fair. When we don't have closure, things feel unjust. They feel unfair. And they feel unsettling, like as though you're never quite comfortable. Like, this just doesn't feel right. It feels as though the narcissistic person in a way is getting away with something. And that's the languaging I hear from a lot of people will say, I just want closure on this. And it's a tricky bit, right? Because when you think about other relationships when we've had closure, it might be that you had the goodbye conversation. And while you might have been sad, with healthy relationships, when you break up, sometimes you end it because you live too far away, or your lives are too different, or the timing was wrong. That can feel like closure. When you say, gosh, if this had been a different time, it would have been so different. And I'm so glad I met them, but we couldn't make it work. That then we don't feel as tense and fractured, and that nagging, unjust, unfair sense that can really fuel a lot of rumination. Do people ever get closure in narcissistic relationships? Sometimes, but as I've often said, sometimes you get your closure either when you no longer need it. So much time has passed that when you find out that the new person left them, or the new person cheated on them, or they lost all their money, or whatever it is, you're sort of like, I just don't care anymore, whatever, who cares? And so there might be a tiny bit of closure, but honestly, you needed all that news probably many years before. So there might be sort of an ending that comes down the road that you hear about. Every so often, that ending might come sooner, so someone's not waiting so long, so you're healing and growing, and then you come to find out maybe 6 months after a breakup that the narcissistic person's trying to hoover you, and you come to find out they're hoovering you because the next person saw what a piece of, what they were and ended the relationship with them. That can certainly help with closure. But folks, I know it's hard to hear this, but the closure comes from you're not having to deal with them anymore. And when you stop to think about the bandwidth, the time, the lightness, the freedom that comes from not having to deal with them anymore, while it can feel terribly unfair that they get to move forward, you got to remember, you're living under a very different playbook than them. For them, relationships are shallow. They exist to validate only them, that they are superficial, that they're associated with status. That's not what you signed up for. So when they find something quickly, when things work out for them quickly, it's often because their idea of something working is much more shallow than what is meaningful to you. You're not playing the same game. You're not living in the same way. But I get it. I get it. And if I had one wish, is that every survivor would get closure a lot faster. But I'll tell you though, let me put this in as the punchline of this video. I'm not so sure that would be great either. Because I got to be frank with you. If some people, their narcissistic person got their sort of comeuppance too quickly, because you may not have had a chance to heal yet, you might have taken him back too. Oh, I feel bad. Well, see, like, they'll be so happy to be with me again. Maybe we need to tough it out for a while so we heal. So by the time the narcissistic person gets kicked to the curb and might come crawling back, that you're too strong to take them back. And let me tell you, there's no closure that feels better than that. Don't try it at home, kids. Do not try to get revenge on a narcissistic person. Why? You're thinking, come on, Dr. Ramani, why not? The short answer to that is because although it seems like it would feel good, in the long term, it's not good for us. It could be dangerous. It could land you in a whole lot of trouble. And it could, and it probably, and I say definitely will, inflame the narcissistic person who may hit back twice as hard, which could certainly get, I mean, it could get literally dangerous, but it's definitely going to take a psychological toll on you. I get a lot of pushback from people who sometimes even tell me that I'm being holier than thou when I tell them that seeking out revenge on a narcissistic person, and frankly on any person, is not a good idea. That said, please hear me. I totally understand why you want to do it. I do. I would too. I have in the past desperately wanted to take revenge on a narcissistic person and held me back, believing that it's a dish best served cold. And there are some narcissistic people from my past that I still hold such rage about that if I find out things went upside down for them or their lives blew up, I'd celebrate a little. I'm not going to be the one to do that revenge, but I have no problem just sort of popping some sparkling cider and saying, there you go, karma's a bitch. But let's talk, because it's universal to want this, but let's talk about why you want revenge. Obviously you do. They hurt you. They harmed you. They made you feel awful. You wasted months, years, maybe decades. They betrayed you. Wanting revenge under those conditions makes sense. Who wouldn't? Because there is so little justice in a narcissistic relationship and so little justice after these relationships happen, the idea of revenge can create that sense that helps us get to the other side, to know that maybe there would be some consequences, that they suffered the way you did. It makes sense. Human brains are wired for that, right? The problem with revenge is that it keeps you stuck. They are still taking some really valuable mental real estate. You are still ruminating, and you may as well still be in the relationship for how much time you waste. It may be about plotting it, spending money on it, covering your tracks, waiting to see if they respond. And when it's done, since so often the revenge doesn't get you fully what you want, you wasted more time on something you've already wasted a lot of time on. Getting revenge on a narcissistic person consists of cutting off their supply and magnifying their shame. That's it. You want to get revenge? That's all it is. Cut off supply, magnify their shame. And that would happen if there was harm to their reputation, if their new sources of supply disappeared, if they lost their power or stature in the world, loss of money, loss of job, loss of platform, whatever it is that is allowing them to hold their power in the world, which is obviously a major source of narcissistic supply for them. Now listen, folks, that is not always legally or ethically possible. There might be subtle ways you could do this. If someone whom the narcissistic person respects, or that the narcissistic person wanted the respect of, were to ask you why your relationship ended, and let's say, for example, it ended because they were unfaithful, you may say, point blank, it ended because he had an affair. But you're never going to know if it had the desired effect. Maybe the person will lose respect for them, maybe not. But the fact is, slander and defamation laws exist, so there isn't much you can say publicly if they don't want you to. And if it harms their income flow, they may come after you legally. And narcissistic people love litigation. They live for it. They love suing people. And they love sending them those big, threatening legal letters. So be prepared for that. People really don't find it satisfying when they are told that the best revenge is to just go out there and live life as your true self, in your best way, and then post about it or make sure they know about it. They don't care. They don't care if you're out there living your best life and posting about it. If they have new supply, they may not care about your fabulous vacation or your weight loss or your new love interest. At best, it may pull for a Hoover for a minute, but probably not full-on revenge. That's not what you're going to achieve. They aren't ruminating the way you are. Listen, as a shrink, I'm going to say it's perfectly fine. It's fine to talk in safe spaces about the revenge you want to get on them. And I have had clients do that for years in therapy. Not for years. I've been doing it for the years. They talk about it for a few months. And we've laughed at their hope that the person that they cheated on and married will end up leaving them or cheating on them or fleecing them out of all their money. Or some folks have the hope that the narcissistic person will lose their job and end up without a place to live. Or the hope that they'll have to spend their holidays alone. Or the hope that they'll get found out on the shady stuff they did at work and be taken out in handcuffs. Or the hope that their business will tank. You can think about it. You can laugh about it. You can turn their profile picture into a dartboard and throw darts at it. That's all fine. Just don't enact it. Honestly, I'm telling you, it is not worth the hassle. It's not worth the legal hassle. It is not worth the ethical hassle. It is not worth the stress. It may not only cause for you, but for your children or other family members or other colleagues or other people close to you. As I said, I get it. And it does. It just disgusts me to see how much narcissistic people get away with, how enabled they are by the world. It makes me sick. And also, while it may not feel like revenge, the best thing you can do is do you. Do the things you want. Live the life you couldn't because they were always in the way. They don't care. And ultimately, guess what? They're stuck being them. They'll never have a successful, deep relationship. They will always be shady. They'll always be judgmental. They'll always be cold. And they will always go through life feeling like a victim. It sucks to be them. None of that is satisfying, though. What I'm saying, it's not satisfying to you when you want them to feel as bad as you do. But the bad you feel comes in part from you having empathy and a heart to break. Their feeling bad has more of everyone's out to get me vibe. I don't get what I want vibe. I once watched a friend go through it rough. Her husband left her. The marriage wasn't good. But he left her and they had, I think, three kids, young kids. Within a week, he was with someone new. Obviously, there was overlap. He didn't find this person in the week. But he, being the gaslighting, horrible man that he was, he denied it. The new woman he ended up with was very wealthy, very young, and they were very public about their relationship, posting pictures from exotic destinations while she sat home with the kids who were a bit sort of rattled by what their dad did. And then the rotten man had the nerve to argue about custody when it was convenient for him and wanting her to work with his vacation schedule. He was a neglectful father, more focused on making out with his new wife and posting public pictures of that than in engaging with his children. But she persisted. She fought hard in court to get therapy for her children. She followed the rules of a custody order written by a narcissistic judge to the letter. She kept impeccable records. And then the kids got into their teens and stood up to dad and said, dude, you're embarrassing. When given an option, they chose mom. And they are now in healthy relationships with mom. Mom never said a disparaging word about him. They put up and endure their dad from time to time. He shows up at the odd graduation or something. But the once shiny marriage that he made with the new fancy tropical destination wife, well, she's narcissistic too. The cracks are showing. The fights are ugly. That took years and years. Is it revenge? Like I said, the old saying goes, revenge is a dish best served cold. With narcissistic folks, I understand how compelling that call to revenge is. You want to think about it, you want to fantasize about it, okay, you even want to hope for it, okay, you do you, but don't enact it. It can feel awful to see them go into a sort of a shiny future with no consideration for you. But being with them was never going to be a good situation for you. You can keep throwing darts at that picture. Just stay safe. I get it. But again, I would rather you don't spend your life in a revenge fantasy, but rather you spend your life growing into your true self rather than forever trying to play that unwinnable game with the narcissistic person. And honestly, have some pity for the person who has to take them on after you. Thanks. The grief over a narcissistic relationship is a very, very unique grief, okay? So it's not the sort of grief of what we typically associate with loss, like we'd see it someone dying or a relationship ending or losing a job. It's not even the grief of losing something like a house burning down or a car getting totaled or losing stuff in a burglary or in a robbery, which are losses which can lead to grief. The grief of a narcissistic relationship is something more unique. It's the loss of a narrative, a loss of innocence. It's the loss, it can be the loss of a family, a loss of hope, a loss of what you hoped life could be, a loss of time, a loss of potential, a loss of opportunity. People waste years in these relationships, and then, once they see it clearly, regret all that had been lost. People maintained narratives about happy families. They would wonder why there was an incongruence, a disconnect between what they so desperately wanted to be true and what the situation in front of them actually was. And that moment of recognition is characterized by grief. These are losses, but because they are losses, you carry in your heart, in your mind, and in your soul, that they may not look like losses to people around you. And you may go through this bizarre experience of grief that you don't even identify as grief. So that's why so many people are going through this saying, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And I'm like, no, it's actually grief. Now, what this video takes on is how this grief sneaks up on you in a very, very interesting and surprising way. Comes up when you're watching a movie or a TV show. It's amazing how often I have talked with many, many survivors of narcissistic relationships and narcissistic abuse who will talk about how a scene in a movie or show that, I don't know, the scene in the movie or the show isn't even really that consequential, that the survivor will actually find themselves tearful and really sad and not be able to hold those tears back. For example, it may be a scene in which a mother is deeply empathic toward a child, or a father is very loving towards their family. It could be any number of compassionate scenes from a marriage. But what catches people who have been through narcissistic relationships by surprise is the strength, how overpowered they feel, and the strength of their reaction, especially to scenes that weren't even meant to be that evocative. In fact, some people have said they were actually a little bit embarrassed because the scene which made them cry wasn't actually, probably not even intended to be a tearjerker scene. But in the context of their lives, of their unique griefs, the simple act of maybe kindness or sacrifice by a character in a film, a person playing a partner or a parent, represented something they so desperately yearned for and finally recognized that they would never get, and would be watching that all play out in a story and just almost amplifying the thing that was missing from their lives. If you have experienced narcissistic abuse, just take a minute. I'd love for you to think about the last scene in a show or a movie that really got to you, and it wasn't the usual kind of tearjerker scene. And actually, if you want, drop that in the comments, like, yeah, the scene was from this particular movie. And pay attention to what that scene was about. Because actually, the tearjerker scene and what evokes this from you could give you some real insight into your grief. Someone was actually recently sharing with me a scene in a film in which the lead character was a young woman. And the young woman had a deeply, sort of really warm, empathic, connected relationship with her father. And the father had a really wonderful sense of humor. He was empathic, he was available, and he made sacrifices for his family and for his children without drawing attention to them. He wasn't a victim, nothing like that. In an actual relatively ordinary scene, inconsequential scene in this movie, when the father brought a little birthday cake to the daughter on the morning of her birthday, this person was telling me she started crying. And people were looking at her strangely. And then she remembered crying again when there was a scene where the father sacrificed an important opportunity he had for himself. He sacrificed it in favor of his son. And she said she just couldn't stop crying. And she was caught off guard by her reaction to these scenes. And even though she had given up on her own relationship with her narcissistic father a long time ago, the potency of the reaction after all these years as it came through the film struck her. And it's interesting because she was also going through a narcissistically abusive intimate relationship. But the never-ending grief of wishing it had been something different with her father, of wondering what a life with a non-rageful, empathic, giving, and open-hearted father who really saw her, she wondered, what would that be like? To recognize that she would go through this life without ever knowing that experience. That's grief. And as she beautifully put it, most days, she didn't even think about it. It didn't even cross her mind. She just her father had his life. He made almost no attempt to even maintain any kind of relationship with her whatsoever. And she herself had her own full life. But the grief was there, hidden away, and reactivated through a simple story of a father and a daughter in a film. And it wasn't even supposed to be a father-daughter film. That was really sort of a sideline story in the film. It's interesting, when I think about the last time I cried during a TV show, it was actually during an absolutely absurd comedy show. And as the series comes to an end, these characters who had actually been really treated horribly and bullied by other people throughout the course of the series, they got very, very happy endings, and they succeeded on their own terms and really authentically. I watched this last episode, I started crying. And my children, because this is a comedy show, looked at me as though I had literally lost my mind. This was not meant to be a poignant scene. So as I went to bed that night, I wondered, what was it that made me so weepy at such a silly scene? And I had to say that I recognized that I identified with the scene. I identified with being told no, and this idea that you're never going to make it, or who do you think you are? And these characters, they retained their good humor all the way through the series, and for once, for one damn time, karma worked out the way you hope it does, because these characters were so sweet. And maybe, in my case, that's the toll of working on narcissistic abuse. Because so rarely in the lives of the folks I work with, the story rarely ends up fair. Maybe it wasn't about the happy ending of this silly show that made me cry, but it was actually the fact that it was a just ending. Because again, that is so rarely how it ends up for survivors of narcissistic abuse. Survivors of narcissistic abuse always have to look past the seeming injustice, the actual injustice of the situation, and find a way to tell the story of their life in this relationship so it feels endurable, and find some meaning in the grief. Because I do grieve for the unfairness that is narcissistic abuse, and see the ongoing toll it takes on people who really do almost grieve that sense of justice. So that said, I ask it again. Have you ever found yourself crying at an unexpected time in a movie? Not the tearjerker that gets everyone, but that scene, just like that silly scene I'm telling you about, that really got you by surprise. What was that show? And maybe even what was that scene? And was it a place that gave you a glimpse into your narcissistic grief? Listen, drop that scene or that film or show or whatever in the comments, and who knows? Maybe somebody looking at these comments and watching this video will end up watching that scene, and it could end up being someone's relief and release as well. I want you to imagine, it's not hard for you to imagine, you are in a narcissistic relationship and you want to talk to someone about it. And you take it to someone who knows both of you. They know you and they know the narcissistic person. And they say to you, oh, I can't hear this. I can't, it's too much for me to hear this about this person. And I can't be there for you. And they go away. I want you to sit with that for a minute and how you felt when that happened. I'm guessing high on that list of how you felt, and maybe weren't even able to put this word to it, is you felt abandoned. And this happens to people all the time in narcissistic relationships, is that they find that when they finally try to talk about the misery of this relationship, that there are people around them who say, oh, it's just too much. It's too hard for me to listen to this. Let's take on this idea of feeling abandoned by the people who just can't take it. So there was a life you had before you knew about and understood narcissism, and there's the life afterwards. Wherever you learned about it, and it's almost like a life split in two. In a way, the life before you understood what narcissism was very difficult. It was full of self-blame, it was full of confusion, but it carried a small luxury. You didn't need to learn and live with the uncomfortable truth of narcissism, how it doesn't change, the harm it can result in, that someone you wanted to have love you, that you loved, was really never going to be able to have a deeply felt, regulated, and sustained and meaningful relationship with you. That is a painful moment and a painful recognition. And once you get it, life may contain more grief where there was once more confusion. Now, before I get into this topic, and it's an important topic, just as a side, anyone who's a therapist, a life coach, or a therapist in training, these are exactly the kind of topics you want to understand well for your clients. And I'm launching a program in January of next year that will focus on how to support clients and ourselves as therapists working with clients who are healing from narcissistic abuse. See the link in that video description. So let's go back to this idea of those of you who did figure it out. You understood narcissism, you apply it to your relationship, and you're living the day-to-day pain of these relationships. You also know that one of the greatest assets in healing and in feeling better is when other people validate your experience. They offer empathy. They get it. When you are in a narcissistic relationship, mirroring becomes a thing of the past. So when it does show up, it can feel like a warm blanket around your shoulders on a cold day. That said, many people don't get it. I would actually hazard to say that most people don't get it, don't get this thing called narcissism. They don't understand how it operates in relationships. Either it hasn't happened to them, or they're narcissistic themselves and they're the problem, or they're enablers who are getting some kind of secondary gain from the narcissistic folks and are invested in not seeing it clearly, or they just want to live in their cozy and naive universe and not have to make the mental shifts to accommodate that this is a thing. That there are folks with these personalities out there, that they cause a lot of anguish and they cause a lot of harm, and that they won't change. There's a lot of people out there who just don't want to know this. So I'll give you an example of this, right? It may be that you're in a narcissistic marriage and you have a parent who says, "Ugh, I don't want to hear about all this awful stuff. You have to be able to work this out." Or a friend who might say about a narcissistic relationship you're in, "Ugh, I don't want to hear about this. It's so dark. It can't be that bad." Or the colleague talking about someone narcissistic you work with and might say, "Oh, come on now, he's full of bark, but there's always a path forward. I can't listen to this stuff." One woman I know who had been married for about 15 years had told me that her marriage to a vulnerable, malignant narcissist obviously was taking a tremendous toll on her, and she had sort of no playbook for this. Her parents had been very happily married, and she had no idea what she was dealing with. Even when there was palpable tension and dismissive and humiliating behavior from her husband in front of her parents, her mother would say banal things such as, "Just love him more. Maybe he's intimidated by you and doesn't know how to be loved." As time went on, and big surprise in this woman's marriage, things did not get better. She was seeing her mother less and less as her husband became more and more controlling and isolating. And she was desperate for someone to talk to and get support from, and she loved her mother. So when she would get little chunks of time with her mother, she'd tell her what was happening in her marriage. And her mother would literally cover her ears and say, "La la la, no, 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 I can't hear these things. Please don't tell me." The daughter felt abandoned by one of her last sources of support. And this happened for no other reason than her mother couldn't tolerate having her sunshiny worldview fractured, and she was willing to let her daughter twist in the wind. Many years ago, I had a similar experience that I've shared on this channel in the past, in which a woman I knew was sharing the horrors of something she was going through, a very malignant narcissistic marriage and very, very expensive, painful, and protracted divorce. The things her husband did were absolutely horrible. And that woman, who was in the terrible marriage, she rarely got out and got to see friends. So she was here out for lunch, and she was telling the assembled group of women the things that were happening, the things that he did. She really didn't have many other places to share it. I was already doing my work in the area of narcissistic abuse, and in conversations I had with her, I was trying to gently nudge her towards radical acceptance and pointing out the uncomfortable truth that it wasn't likely that he would change. And another woman at the table, someone who happened to be very fortunate and have a very happy marriage and plenty of money and a relatively simple and much easier life, said, "Okay, ladies, it's lunch. It's too much. I can't hear this. I don't want to hear things like this." I was absolutely disgusted because in this case, the woman was going through hell. And the unwillingness of this little spoiled lady to hear it because it didn't pair well with her chicken salad and that it would make her uncomfortable was deeply shaming. I never agreed to spend time with that shaming woman again. I have no idea what happened to her. No, it wasn't easy to hear what this woman was sharing about her marriage. It wasn't. But sustained friendship, and certainly being a parent, as in the other story, means you sit with another person's pain. And you don't push it away because you can't handle it or because it doesn't fit in with your worldview. The people who can't handle it, who look away, who can't be there for you, maybe what they're happening is a mix of betrayal blindness, cognitive dissonance, and good old-fashioned immaturity. That they want to keep a cotton candy, glossy worldview of not wanting to believe that someone in their midst was so harmful and trying to make the pieces fit in a way that leaves the world feeling fair and good. It feels simple. I have watched people I care for who have been in narcissistic relationships face this kind of steely rejection in the face of their suffering because culturally it didn't make sense. The obsession with marriage and family overrode their capacity to be there for someone who was suffering. In my book, that is not okay. And culture is often a driver of this. The focus on these constructs, loyalty, family, hierarchy, means that many people around the world are left to endure the manipulations, the confusion of narcissistic abuse alone, and endure the double wound of being invalidated and shamed, not just within their narcissistic relationship, but also by the people around them who are supposed to love them and have their backs and not walk away because you're sharing something with them that they don't love to hear. But ultimately, when someone says, la, 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 I can't hear this, it's too painful, that's a form of abandonment. Nobody wants this to happen to them. And the only reason people would share it with anyone is because they need to share it. They've been gaslighted into oblivion and they're desperate for a reality check. So when people shut their ears and can't allow their precious worldviews to be punctured, that qualifies to me as an abandonment. Sometimes these folks who do this are enablers, but not always. In the case of the mother-daughter, it's not even as though that mother had any particular affinity or that she liked the narcissistic husband. Interestingly, it was just that she didn't want to hear that there was any awfulness in the world. Many people have these stories of family members who would rather watch a family member suffer than to have their worldview sullied. And many of these folks said, the narcissist is the narcissist. They are empty, hollow, shallow people, and with radical acceptance, I got there. But what really stung was to have the people who I know could have done more and been more, to have them turn their backs on me, that was the bruise that they carried. That ended up being what fueled their lack of trust and abandonment fears every bit as much, and in many cases more, than what was actually happening in the narcissistic relationship. Once you understand narcissism, you're like, okay, narcissist is going to narcissist. But when the people you actually think around you are decent people aren't able to be there for you, it really can do a number on you. I know it isn't this simple, but I do sometimes wonder if the world is basically divided into those that are narcissistic or antagonistic, those that are being harmed by these relationships, those who are the enablers, and those who do not want to believe that any of this is a thing because it is icky and it's uncomfortable and it is easier to pretend that it isn't happening. For those of you who are going through the rigors of narcissistic abuse, having the experience of people you care about saying to you, shh, 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 don't talk about this. I can't hear this. That experience may be every bit, if not even a little, maybe even a little more harmful to you than enduring the narcissistic abuse. And when you put those two experiences together, it results in an experience of aloneness and isolation, and it magnifies the self-blame and the anxiety. And it's not okay. I know the people who do this to other people are not watching this video or this channel. But if this has happened to you, yes, it is a thing. If it has happened that when you finally try to share it with someone, they basically abandon you, it is a thing. And it can take the process of healing and make it far, far more difficult and painful. I hope that helps, and thanks again.